The Single-Action Revolver. Every revolver on this list eventually gets compared back to the gun that defined the entire American West, and that comparison starts with a simple mechanical fact. A true single-action revolver only fires after the shooter manually pulls the hammer back before every single shot. Unlike nearly every modern revolver most shooters handle today, Colt's 1873 single-action Army, nicknamed the Peacemaker, paired that manual cocking action with a loading gate on the side of the frame and a spring-loaded ejector rod to punch out spent cases one at a time, a genuinely slow reload by modern standards that shooters of the era simply accepted as the cost of a simple, rugged design. The Peacemaker itself grew directly out of an earlier Colt design called the Open Top, developed once a key rival patent covering bored-through cylinders finally expired in 1870, freeing Colt to build a proper metallic cartridge firing revolver, years after Smith & Wesson had already cornered that entire growing market segment. General George Patton carried an engraved ivory-handled SAA into combat during World War II, nearly 70 years after its original 1873 introduction, and Colt has now produced the same basic revolver across 4 separate manufacturing eras spanning more than 150 years of continuous demand, proof that a design built around one deliberate limitation, one hammer pull per shot, never actually needed fixing in the first place. The Double-Action Revolver. A double-action revolver solves the single action's biggest limitation by letting one long trigger pull do 2 jobs at once, rotating the cylinder and dropping the hammer in a single continuous motion, while still allowing a shooter to manually cock the hammer first for a lighter, more precise single-action shot whenever there's time to take one carefully. That flexibility made double-action revolvers like Smith & Wesson's K-frame military and police, later renamed the Model 10, the standard sidearm for American police departments for most of the 20th century, since officers could carry it safely with the hammer down and still fire quickly under pressure without a separate manual cocking step slowing them down. The trade-off for that flexibility is a genuinely heavy trigger pull in double-action mode, often 2 to 3 times the weight of a tuned single-action trigger, a deliberate compromise between speed and precision that shaped how an entire generation of police training treated the double-action revolver as the default duty sidearm. Smith & Wesson later stretched the same double-action formula into the Model 19 Combat Magnum, a slightly lighter-framed revolver chambered in .357. Magnum specifically marketed to officers who wanted more stopping power than the Model 10's .38 Special without stepping all the way up to a heavier end-frame Magnum revolver, built for hunting rather than daily duty carry. If you've ever wondered why some revolvers hide the hammer while others show it off, that's the kind of design decision this channel breaks down. One mechanism at a time. Subscribe if you want the next one explained. The Snub-Nose Revolver. Colt's 1927 Detective Special proved a genuine market existed for a full power .38 special revolver small enough to actually hide in a coat pocket or a waistband, and Smith & Wesson answered in 1950 with a competitor purpose built to win that fight directly, the J-Frame Chiefs Special, introduced at the same International Association of Chiefs of Police convention its name still references today, decades later. Built with a barrel typically under 2 inches long and cut down to just 5 rounds instead of the standard 6, the snub-nose trades capacity and sight radius for a compact profile that disappears completely under a jacket or inside a pocket, exactly the trade-off plainclothes detectives and off-duty officers needed most. That basic J-frame formula proved so successful that Smith & Wesson is still selling variations of the same core design over 70 years later. Copied extensively by Ruger, Taurus, and Charter Arms along the way, Smith & Wesson's entry didn't just compete with Colt's Detective Special, it dethroned it entirely since the J-frame's smoother, Single-stage double-action trigger pull and slightly smaller overall size gave concealed carriers of the era a real, tangible reason to switch brands after nearly a quarter century of unchallenged Colt dominance in the snub-nose category. The Hammerless Revolver. Reaching for a concealed revolver during a real emergency creates one specific risk a standard exposed hammer never solves cleanly: snagging on clothing during the draw, especially from inside a pocket where fabric bunches up around the gun constantly. Smith & Wesson's answer, introduced in 1952 as the Centennial, enclosed the hammer completely inside the frame, making the revolver double action only with absolutely nothing external to catch on a pocket lining or a jacket hem during a fast draw under stress. The earliest Centennial models even included a grip safety borrowed straight from 1911 pistol design, a feature that actually hurt the gun's early popularity since shooters found it an unnecessary complication on a revolver that arguably never needed one in the first place. And Smith & Wesson quietly dropped that grip safety from later production runs entirely. Modern hammerless J-frames remain a favorite specifically for pocket carry today, since a shooter can fire directly through a jacket pocket in a genuine emergency without any hammer spur catching on the fabric mid-draw. A real practical advantage over a standard exposed hammer revolver in that exact scenario. Smith & Wesson eventually split the difference with the bodyguard model, shrouding the hammer under a small protective hump instead of hiding it completely, letting a shooter still thumb-cock the gun for a precise single-action shot when time allows while keeping most of the snag resistance the fully hammerless Centennial offered. The large-frame Magnum Revolver. Elmer Keith spent years hand-loading increasingly hot .44 special cartridges before finally convincing Smith & Wesson and Remington to commercialize his work as the .44 Magnum, and in 1955, Smith & Wesson built a revolver specifically to handle that considerably more powerful new round, stretching their largest end frame to create what would eventually become known as the Model 29. Sales were genuinely disappointing at first, popular mainly with a small circle of serious handgun hunters, right up until Clint Eastwood pointed one at the camera in 1971 and called it the most powerful handgun in the world, instantly turning a slow-selling hunting revolver into a cultural phenomenon retailers couldn't keep in stock for years afterward. Large-frame Magnum revolvers like the Model 29 remain the go-to choice for handgun hunters chasing big game today. Built with reinforced steel frames and cylinders specifically engineered to handle cartridges that would eventually crack a smaller-framed revolver after just a few full cylinders of Magnum ammunition. Smith & Wesson later introduced the mountain gun variant in the 1990s, trimming weight off the same end frame specifically for hunters who wanted full .44 Magnum power without carrying the extra ounces of a standard Model 29 on a long day hiking through steep backcountry terrain. The Top-Break Revolver. Before swing-out cylinders became the industry standard, reloading a revolver quickly meant solving an entirely different mechanical problem, and the Top-Break design solved it by hinging the entire barrel and cylinder assembly downward at the frame, automatically triggering a star-shaped extractor that ejects every spent case simultaneously the moment the action folds open, rather than forcing a shooter to punch cases out one at a time. Smith & Wesson's Model 3 Schofield used exactly this system in the 1870s, valued by cavalry troopers who could reload from horseback far faster than fumbling with a single-actions loading gate one round at a time under the pressure of actual combat, and British forces carried Top-Break Webley service revolvers, using the same basic principle all the way through the First World War and well into the Second. The design eventually fell out of favor for one simple reason. The hinge itself wears loose with heavy use over time, gradually loosening the lockup between the barrel and frame in a way a solid, non-hinged, swing-out cylinder revolver never has to deal with. Britain kept the Top-Break concept alive longer than most other nations, fielding the Enfield No. 2 revolver through the Second World War even as swing-out cylinder designs had already become the clear industry standard practically everywhere else on the planet. The Automatic Revolver. Colonel George Fosbery wanted the crisp trigger and rapid cycling of the semi-automatic pistols just reaching the market in the 1890s, combined with the heavy .455 cartridge of the standard British service revolver, and his solution, patented in 1896 and built by Webley starting in 1901, remains one of the strangest firearms ever placed into limited commercial production anywhere in the world. Rather than a fixed frame, the Webley-Fosbery's upper barrel and cylinder assembly slides backward under recoil using distinctive zigzag grooves cut into the cylinder to rotate it and recock the hammer automatically, essentially building the self-cycling action of a semi-automatic pistol directly into a traditional revolver's mechanism. Competitive shooter Walter Winans used one to fire 12 rounds into a 3-inch target in about 15 seconds using a speed loader, a genuinely impressive pace for the year 1902. Decades before speed shooting became a recognized competitive discipline in its own right, the exposed sliding mechanism proved dangerously prone to jamming once mud or dirt got into the action, though, and with barely 4,750 ever produced before production ended in 1924, the automatic revolver remains a fascinating dead end rather than the future anyone at the time expected it to be. Before machine guns became standard aircraft armament, some British pilots in the First World War actually carried the Webley-Fosbery into the cockpit, specifically for its rapid rate of fire against enemy aircraft and observation balloons, one of the stranger footnotes in a design history already full of them from the very start. The Convertible Revolver. Every single revolver so far on this list is built around a single cartridge for its entire service life, locked into whatever caliber it left the factory chambered for, and the Convertible Revolver breaks that rule by shipping with 2 complete, interchangeable cylinders instead of just one. A Ruger Blackhawk sold in .45 Colt, for example, often comes packaged from the factory with a second cylinder chambered in .45 ACP, letting an owner swap between the classic revolver round and a common semi-automatic pistol cartridge in seconds, using nothing more than the same simple takedown pin every other cylinder swap on the gun already requires. That flexibility turns one single revolver into 2 distinct range guns, since .45 ACP typically costs less and generates noticeably less recoil than full-power .45 Colt loads, giving budget-conscious shooters a genuine reason to practice more often with the exact same gun they'd actually carry daily. Ruger's Single 6 takes the same convertible concept even further down the affordability scale, pairing a .22 long rifle cylinder with a second cylinder chambered in .22 Winchester Magnum, letting new shooters practice cheaply with standard rimfire ammunition while still having a noticeably harder hitting option available in the exact same revolver whenever they genuinely want it, all without ever buying a second gun or learning a second set of controls from scratch.